Deep in the frozen Arctic lies an abandoned complex unchanged for 30 years. The only inhabitants in this polar desert are the occasional muskox or caribou. Dangerous chemicals now threaten to leak into the permafrost as the decaying buildings become an incubator for mold. The site disguises the location of Astrogard, a lost colony of Vikings who have been isolated from the world and protected from the cold by the heat of a very gentle volcano. And no, that's the setting of the 1974 film The Island at the Top of the World, produced by Disney and directed by Robert Stevenson. The real town of Mould Bay is located on Prince Patrick Island in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and life there is a lot less hospitable. Prince Patrick Island is the westernmost member of the Queen Elizabeth Islands in the Northwest Territories of Canada. The island is typically icebound all year, and its northwest coast butts up against the summertime limit of the polar ice cap, making it one of the most inaccessible parts of Canada even to this day. Wikipedia even lists its highest point as unnamed. Prior to the modern era, no evidence of human habitation has ever been found on the island, and because it was never settled, it actually has no Inuit name. It was even too far removed and barren for the Dorset culture, which inhabited much of the archipelago during the medieval warm period. The island was first sighted by European explorers in 1853 by Lieutenant George Meacham, and later named for Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, who was apparently also called Arthur William Patrick Albert, and for some reason his third name was chosen for the island. The prince was only 3 years old at the time of its discovery, but would later become the Governor General of Canada in 1911, seen here trying desperately not to go bald. Prince Patrick Island was explored on foot in the spring and summer of 1853 by Meacham and Captain Francis Leopold McClintock. Mould Bay itself would be discovered by McClintock on the return path to his ship, the HMS Intrepid, which was lodged in the ice near Dealey Island. The reason for this rather foreshadowing name is probably contained in McClintock's logbooks, which are currently housed in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, but unfortunately they have not been digitized, and, well, I don't live in England. Most of the information I have to go on comes from this book, published in 1857 and written by Master George McDougall, an officer on board the HMS Resolute, the companion ship of the Intrepid, which would later be used to build the Resolute desk that sits in the White House and hides the wood plank that contains directions to the lost city of gold, which is buried underneath Mount Rushmore. The book unfortunately contains very little about McClintock's journey and a lot about different ways to cook pemmican, if you're interested in that. It does, however, contain an excerpt from Lieutenant Meacham's expedition, where he describes finding 3 trees near a cliffside by Walker Inlet, which they promptly chopped down and used as firewood. It wasn't uncommon to find driftwood in the Arctic, but the idea of trees in this landscape seems inconceivable to me, especially as the modern-day tree line is about 500 miles south on the mainland. I can't find any other information about this, so if anyone has experience with trees in the Arctic, let me know. Meacham and McClintock were a part of the second of 3 missions made in search of Sir John Franklin's famously lost 1845 expedition intended to find the Northwest Passage. His 2 ships, HMS Erebus and Terror, were only found on the ocean floor as recently as 2014. Ironically, it was the search for Franklin that would reveal both the passage itself as well as much of the high Arctic to European audiences. Because of the difficulty involved with just reaching the area, Prince Patrick Island wouldn't be visited again for 62 years, when it was first fully surveyed in 1915 by Vilhjalmur Stephenson as a part of the Canadian Arctic expedition, which was also plagued by disasters and controversy, but that's a story for another time. The island was visited briefly for a 3rd time in 1937 by Sir Hubert Wilkins, using a consolidated PBY flying boat while searching for the lost Russian pilot Sigismund Levanevsky, who also was never found. After the Second World War, the far-flung reaches of the Arctic quickly became much more geopolitically important, and in 1946, a joint US-Canada program was launched to fill in this blind spot in surveillance and scientific data. The program was creatively named the Joint Arctic Weather Stations, or JAWS, and had a not-so-hidden secondary purpose of solidifying Canadian sovereignty over the high Arctic. The program would establish 2 large stations, first at Eureka Bay and then at Resolute Bay on Cornwallis Island, which would become the hub of the network. Aerial surveys of Prince Patrick Island began on March 23, 1948, and the site at Mould Bay was selected for its long valley set between two hard gravel ridges. Construction of the station moved quickly, with a temporary structure being set up by April 11th, and 32 airlifts completed by the 25th of the same month. The site would host a crew of 3 Canadians and 4 Americans, and weather observations began in June of that year. The airstrip, which was later expanded in 1958, could provide coverage of the entire Northwest Passage within minutes, and the station itself would eventually house up to 40 people. Mould Bay and the equally far-flung Isaacson Station were established as satellite complexes, as they could only be resupplied by air. Both hosted small and incredibly isolated teams, communicating with the outside world only through scientific data and mail that arrived only once a month. Over time, the size of the crew would increase, and Mould Bay even had a tiny customs booth for people arriving directly from the U.S. The Canadian government at one point had a plan to resettle Inuit people to the area, although this was scrapped in 1956 after significant public backlash. In 1961, new magnetic and seismic observatories would be installed, along with some station upgrades, like a new mess hall and rec facility. Supposedly, the seismic observations taken at Mould Bay were some of the most precise in the world, as the area was completely devoid of background noise that could disturb the instruments. The island was also found to be slightly geologically active, although no trace of the volcano at Astrogard, unfortunately. The loudest thing at Mould Bay was probably the band formed by the station crew at one point, which consisted of harmonica, jaw harp, and wooden sticks. And I feel like that proves that the cabin fever was probably pretty bad. In 1971, the United States withdrew from the joint mission, and now shouldering the total cost of the project, the Canadian government decided to close down Isaacson Station and cannibalize its equipment for use at Mould Bay, bringing over an additional tractor and a bunch of spare parts. Significant upgrades were made in 1985 with the construction of a new 2-story ops building containing a kitchen, bedrooms, and a lounge, but the biggest change in terms of day-to-day life was the installation of a satellite phone. By 1990, however, the buildings were already observed to be sinking into the permafrost, but it would be rising fuel costs that would put the final nail in the coffin for Mould Bay. The constant airlifts required to resupply the station made it very expensive to operate, and one official at the time is quoted as saying, "You could close Mould Bay and save 20 stations down south." Continuous weather observations ended on March 31st, 1997, and the station was replaced by an automated observation system. But unlike Isaacson, the station buildings were left mothballed in the hopes that they could be easily reactivated someday. In this case, however, mothballed means they basically did nothing and left. Since then, multiple attempts have been made to clean up Mould Bay, but as of yet no remediation has actually taken place. All of the buildings and vehicles were simply left as they were, along with the stockpile of hundreds of old fuel drums to facilitate a reopening that never came. In 2003, a decision was made to fully decommission the site, but according to this article published in 2009, the decommissioning was delayed and 7.3 million of the 8 million allocated for the cleanup cannot be accounted for. A 2009 study of contaminated sites in the Arctic found that the complex has become an incubator for dangerous molds and is considered a hazard for humans. The most recent development seems to be a causeway reconstruction that took place in the summer of 2020, which is an important milestone towards the eventual environmental remediation of the site. As you can see from this satellite imagery from this year, the team set up a temporary facility at the base of the runway to support the reconstruction, but it doesn't seem like anything has been done since then. I can't find any information about the current plans for this site, and it's quite possible that there are none. So, until the Canadian government decides to follow through on their commitment, Mould Bay will remain frozen in time, a decaying ghost town at the top of the earth.